Welcome to the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Grant-Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox. This week, we're covering the DOJ's new guidance on FCPA enforcement, sanctions on Russia from Europe, but maybe not from the US, whether we've exited the golden age of compliance, and what happened when a Florida man dressed as a cop tried to pull over a real one. But first, how has your week been, Tom? What do you think is the most interesting development?
Kristy, I went to a great retreat this weekend. I'm a member of something called the C-Suite Executive Council, which is largely that, C-Suite executives, entrepreneurs, and other business owners. Not very many lawyers, no compliance officers, a few podcasters. So it's very different than my normal group of people I hang around, and I learned so much from them. I get to talk about podcasting. I love that. And it was a great learning experience for me for the weekend.
Fabulous. Where do you want to start today?
Somewhat bittersweetly, I want to start with Boeing. And of course, I think all of our listeners will recall there was a devastating Boeing 787 Dreamliner air crash about 10 days ago in India. But what that has to do with us, what it has to do with compliance, what it has to do with Two Gurus is we're recording this on Wednesday the 18th. On Monday the 16th was the scheduled trial of Boeing to start. And listeners will recall that the Department of Justice threw up the surrender white flag, gave Boeing a non-prosecution agreement with no external monitor reporting to anyone but Boeing, and said Boeing's done everything we've asked. Maybe not. But the thing that makes this case so unique, Kristy, once again we have talked about, are the families of the victims of the first two 737 MAX crashes. They have, by law, an interest in this settlement, and they have raised hackles in their filings about this non-prosecution agreement, and that was before the crash. Now, there's going to have to be a hearing because even though it's a non-prosecution agreement and Boeing is not being charged with anything criminally, the government has a unilateral right to dismiss that case. The victims also have a say, and the court is on record criticizing Boeing and their culture in some of the previous hearings. And so it's now an opportunity for the court to take a fresh look at all of this, and I think maybe explore why an external monitor is so important to Boeing. Earlier this week, in an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, one of the very conservative business columnist said America needs Boeing, and he was 110% right. We need them as a company, we need them as a manufacturing entity, we need them as a national security manufacturer and provider. We need airliners, and we need a robust airline manufacturer functioning well in the United States. This week is the week of the Paris Air Show. Guess who's getting all the orders? And I'll give you a hint. It's not Boeing. I think it is absolutely imperative that this government, in the form of the Trump administration, recognize the importance of Boeing and that the vested interest we all have, and I'm going to include us because you and I travel a lot, and we're on Boeing jets a lot of the time. And we are stakeholders in this discussion. But the victims, the families of the victims, certainly have their rights to be considered, and I hope the court will do something, or that maybe even Boeing and the Department of Justice will decide that for optics only, not having an external monitor is just an unmitigated disaster. Because even if Boeing does the greatest job, we won't know about it. And we, all of us, including you and I and our listeners, deserve to know, has Boeing fixed its culture, which led to the two 737 MAX crashes? We don't know yet what caused the 787 Dreamliner, but it's yet another crash where all but one person died. I'm sure from Boeing's perspective, this is the absolute worst time to have a crash, and they may be right, but it really drove home to me the need for some kind of external oversight, whether it's government, whether it's a court, whether it's a monitor, whatever it may be. Somebody needs to be watching Boeing's culture and make sure they get it right.
Yeah, this is a double down for sure. The article noted that the 787 has never been in a crash previously, so they think it's probably pilot error as opposed to a safety issue. But regardless, you're right about timing, you're right about optics. And I think that there is even perhaps an opportunity to say, hey, look, we're okay with somebody guiding us in this, because to a certain degree, if you don't have an external monitor, it's pretty difficult to say, hey, how are we fixing all of this without somebody who's an expert that's done it over and over again fixing it. So we'll see what happens, but I'm disappointed. Which leads me to my first story, especially when it comes to monitors, which is the biggest compliance story in the last few days, and that's the halting of the pausing of the FCPA enforcement. So as probably everyone in the compliance field knows, President Trump issued an executive order in February temporarily halting enforcement of the FCPA while the DOJ, which is the Department of Justice, reviewed its current prosecution resolutions and how to move forward. So the good news is that the FCPA enforcement should make a comeback, but it may have new targets. So priority areas for enforcement include bribery related to cartels and transnational criminal organizations, frequently called TCOs. That includes, of course, international gangs. Also, cases where a specific and identifiable U.S. entity was unable to fairly compete because of foreign bribery, that's high on the list, as will misconduct affecting national security and national security interests. Lastly, the DOJ stressed that it will be focusing on complex high-value bribery. So this includes bribery related to fraud and obstruction of justice in furtherance of a bribe. So I'm guessing we're not going to see many prosecutions for box seats at the Beyonce concert this presidential term. And corporate monitorships, the bee in my bonnet, are even further on the back burner than they were before. About them, the department had to say this, quote, "We believe the measures we've instituted in place of monitorships more quickly transition companies to full compliance. These self-directed measures limit the wasted effort and financial resources that are expended when companies are forced to focus more on teaching to the test, so to speak, rather than making lasting improvements," unquote. All right, I'll just say right there that nobody's watching to make sure they make lasting improvements or that they've made the transition to full compliance, but that's just my take on this thing. All right, Tom, I barely scratched the surface on all of the advice here. And the other thing I would say is it was hostile. The language used in the speech that these priorities come from was rather hostile to the defense bar. This came out at the ACI conference in Washington, D.C. So look, there's a lot going on in this document, Tom. I know you. I'm sure you've dug into every sentence. What do you think is most interesting or struck you most about what happened with this new series of guidance?
Let me first start with perhaps the continuity and the things that we have heard literally since 2015. And so there was some consistency from this Deputy Attorney General, Dag Todd Blanche, that literally went back to the Yates memo from 2015, one of which was, we're going to go after individuals.
Oh, yeah, that.
Sally Yates said, we're going to go after your individuals. Yes. So a little consistency there. On the national security interest, the thing that became interesting for me, Kristy, was that American economic interests are now a national security interest in the form of U.S. companies winning contracts. Now, under the Biden administration, we had the statement on, or the policy on corruption, which elevated anti-corruption to a national security interest. Now we have the United States getting business overseas elevated to a national security interest. So that may change the focus a little bit. I was on a webinar this morning with Brazil, and I said, you guys are going to be under the gun now because any of your companies engage in bribery or corruption and a U.S. company loses, the DOJ may well take a look at you if they can somehow have jurisdiction over you. And I think it potentially puts a lot more pressure on non-U.S. companies who engage in bribery or corruption yet may have some sort of U.S. nexus, whether that's a stock exchange, whether it's an office, whether it's a U.S. subsidiary, whether it's an ADR, whether it's we did part of the scam inside the United States, or they wired money through the United States. That's sort of one angle. The second angle was they delineated a series of industries that are also seem to be now national security. Probably no surprise that extractive minerals was on there. oil and gas or minerals or whatever it may be. But it expanded it to tech sectors. It expanded it to healthcare sectors. It expanded it to sectors traditionally not thought of as national security issues. We've had FCPA enforcement actions in a wide variety of sectors, and I think that part will continue as well. There were a couple of things that really would apply for our defense bar brethren who sit across from the Department of Justice. One was the DOJ is instructed to move as expeditiously as possible in their investigation. Well, what that means is external counsel is going to have to move, not just external counsel, companies have to move as expeditiously as possible. That means starting with your hotline, your anonymous reporting, your speak up, your listen up. Well, okay, you got the report. You've got to triage it. You've got to get it to someone internally who's competent and capable to take a deeper dive into it. Do you need to bring in outside counsel? When do you bring in outside counsel? And outside counsel does their investigation. We found something. When do you disclose? Do you disclose all before all the facts are developed, or do you wait and see? So I think there will be a significant amount of pressure on the company/external counsel side of things, even though the DOJ prosecutors are to bring cases as expeditiously as possible. It was funny, when I talked about that on the webinar this morning, someone piped up and said the Brazilian government moves at the speed of the Brazilian government, not faster, not slower. And it doesn't matter whether you use the word expeditiously. And that's the reality of dealing with governments outside the United States, whether you have to use a multilateral treaty to get information or letters rogatory through a U.S. district court, whatever the mechanism may be. The second thing is, and this was really interesting, is that previously, when there was a resolution, DOJ prosecutors were to consider the disruption to the company, both in terms of business and to individual and to the employees. Now prosecutors are required to consider this during the entire investigative process. So if you're a defense counsel, you might start saying early on, that's really disruptive to our company.
Isn't an investigation always disruptive to the company?
It's always disruptive. Yes. Whether the DOJ accepts that, how much the top brass, you can appeal to them or that issue, I don't know. But potentially it's something you can start to talk about, recognizing you have to maintain at least credibility with the prosecutors during this process. I think there are some, I'm not sure refocus is the right words, because focus, I think, around these business contracts, business development, other types of economic issues we hadn't seen a focus on before. I think non-U.S. companies may come under greater scrutiny now. Certainly if you're shipping goods through Colombia or Venezuela, or not Venezuela, but Mexico or some other place where their cartels have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations, you're going to have much more scrutiny there. But we visited about why that may be true already, and now we may have an FCPA overlay on that. Otherwise, the speech was just a hoot. There's clear contempt from this Department of Justice to everybody, but that certainly includes defense counsel. But as with all things Trump administration, the proof will be in the pudding. And I was asked today, give us some examples, Tom, and I said, I can't. We don't have any yet. And until we either get declinations, we get enforcement actions, we get NPAs, we get DPAs, we get criminal informations filed, any of that, we really won't be able to say with any certainty, this is how it's been interpreted and this is how it will go forward. But it's a policy statement issued by the Deputy Attorney General, and I think it's entitled to the gravitas of that alone.
Hey, look, we're back on. At least we're back on. It's better than being on pause. We're halting the pause and we're going forward, which is very exciting. Speaking about going forward slowly as opposed to quickly and expeditiously, Tom, what do you want to talk about when it comes to Venezuela?
Actually, I want to talk about CITGO, because CITGO is a U.S. company domiciled in the great state of Texas, owned by PDVSA, the Venezuelan national oil company. And PDVSA hadn't paid their bills for many years, so some enterprising debt holders brought an action to strip PDVSA of the ownership of CITGO, pay into the bankruptcy court, and get control of the company. So we have a major U.S. petroleum entity owned by the Venezuelans, who it looks like it's going to have a new owner in August. And spoiler alert, I represented CITGO 35 years ago.
Wow. Was it this action?
No, but it was this plant, this refinery. But and then they have a large corporate compliance staff of very well thought of compliance folks in Houston, who I know personally, who actually have a data scientist in the compliance department. Kudos to them for having that. But they have lived under this divestiture for some period of time, and it's got to be unsettling. What the new owner is going to do is unknown. They could bring it in and run it. They could bring it in and break it up. They could bring it in and sell it for scrap. They'll be the owner and they can do what they want. It really speaks to a level of uncertainty that happens when you do business with people like PDVSA or the Venezuelans, and how yet all through this, the compliance function at CITGO has continued to operate and continue to run, and they've had no FCPA enforcement actions during this entire process. So hats off to them.
We're looking forward for their resolution because, as we know, humans are much less comfortable with even bad news than no news or not knowing what the outcome is going to be. So good for them, and good for you for representing them, Tom. Okay. Let's switch gears to something I was involved in last week. So I went to the Compliance in AI, is the inaugural one, which was excellent. Shout out to Opal Group and Meredith Anastasio, who was the organizer. The conference included this regulatory session that I wanted to bring up with you. So a former DOJ prosecutor posited that the golden age of compliance is over, and it lasted from 2008 to 2023, which he said was actually quite long because most of these cycles are 8 years in his theory. So he believes that we were in 2008 to 2023 at the height of regulatory compliance enforcement to focus on compliance by companies, and that he believes the compliance enforcement and prioritization happen in a predictable cycle. So stage one is new laws or new focuses from enforcement. So everyone's focusing on meeting the moment, creating the processes. Then you get the heavy regulatory enforcement. People double down on compliance. Then complacency sets in, which is where he thinks we are. So that the only actual deterrent for companies is catastrophe or reputational damage that's big enough to matter. And that then the cycle starts over with either new regulations or a shift in enforcement that creates a new focus going back to stage one. So the prosecutor was a little bit doom and gloom, but thinks it will eventually come out. But Tom, I don't know, have we exited this golden age of compliance? And are we in a period, in your opinion, where the only deterrent is in fact reputational catastrophe? What do you think?
Would you share with us the name of this former DOJ prosecutor?
I would have to look it up, and I don't know that he wants to be quoted. So there we are.
All right. An unconfirmed source speculated.
No, I heard it. Go ahead.
I think he's spot on. I think he's spot on for reasons he hasn't articulated. And the reason is Donald J. Trump, Taco Don himself. And he gave us, on February 10th, a suspension of FCPA investigation and enforcement. 2 days later, Wei Chin said in a blog post, "Hey guys, change is here. We have to show our value to the corporation, and it's time to, quote, up your game," end quote. She spoke to the ethics and compliance. But I took her clarion call and said, she's absolutely right. The golden age, if we want to call it that, is over now, because at least under this administration, if we see FCPA enforcement, it's going to be a very, very different flavor. And corporate compliance programs have to be able to justify themselves in a way they may not have had to during these past 15 years. And that we can do so because we can operationalize compliance directly into the business operations of the company using AI. And that's why I wrote a book called Upping Your Game. And I'm not sure I buy his cycles, but it's certainly an interesting way to look at it. I think he's right. At the end of the day, I'm not sure I agree with his analysis, but it's a great way to think about it. Certainly, when you and I started, things were ramping up, and I would have said that the focus of aggressive enforcement lasted about till the 1MDB and Goldman Sachs. And we hadn't seen anything billions of dollars in fines since then. Maybe companies started to get it, or there was something else going on, but we started to see a reduction in overall enforcement actions under the Biden administration. So we can't blame this on Donald Trump or even his second administration. So I think we are at the end of a cycle, but I think we are at the end of a cycle because the president thinks the FCPA is a horrible law and he doesn't like it, and his DOJ had to put something around his wishes. So here's to you, tacos.
You frightened me, Tom. This isn't a political podcast. Okay. Speaking of, what's the next thing you picked?
A political story.
I know.
So here we have from the New York Times, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, not Senator Marco Rubio, has asked the OFAC and Department of Treasury to open an investigation into Harvard University's involvement in a conference where a blacklisted Chinese entity was also a part of the conference. And this is clearly retaliation against Harvard for their stance and their not caving into the Trump administration's demands. But I can't recall, Kristy, a time where I ever saw the Secretary of State say, I'm referring an export control matter over to you. And that's a level of something new that we haven't seen before. But it brings up a really interesting point because universities send people to conferences all the time. You and I go to conferences all the time, and we rarely vet the other attendees. Maybe never. So are you now going to be called out civilly or criminally for others who attended the conference? This is not a conference organizer paying you $50,000 to come speak in Moscow. This is going to a conference. And what's the ramifications of that? And then just the ring fencing of information and not sharing ideas and not having a robust conversation across the globe is certainly something that would denigrate the American experience. But it's a level that we have not seen from the Secretary of State. We've not seen conferences targeted as opposed to doing business with prohibited individuals, and something new and different under the Trump administration.
Yeah, I really hope that we don't have to start asking Compliance Week and the SCCE for a full list of people who are coming to decide whether or not our company can sponsor us to go. Look, I really hope, I don't have a lot of hope, but I hope that OFAC realizes that it has got much, much better things to do than go after tangential involvement of a sanctioned party in a conference that was meant to improve healthcare and healthcare access to over 1 billion people in China. Things like going after companies intentionally selling pivotal national security technology, which we've seen in some enforcement actions recently. So we'll see, but I don't think this should be a very high priority for the Department of the Treasury.
But you're going to talk to us about something much more pleasant.
I have a happy article to talk about, and I chose something that's very unusual for us from Fast Company, and it was called Building Brands with Culture, which is a kind of normal topic for us, except that the culture they're talking about is pop culture. So the story was actually about a partnership between cosmetic brand e.l.f. and Purdue University. And they discussed the ways that they handled this partnership at the always very cool South by Southwest conference, which I know is in Texas, Tom. Austin, Texas, about how marketers can build bonds with customers by boldly tapping into cultural moments. Purdue University and e.l.f. teamed up to go all in on the Taylor Swift Eras Tour. So the day before the concert in Indianapolis, Purdue and e.l.f. Beauty hosted an event called In Our STEM Era. So STEM is all capitalized. It is science, technology, engineering, and what is my M? Mathematics. That's right. Purdue and the cosmetic brand talked about the science behind cosmetics at the event, and participants were invited to make friendship bracelets using binary code where colored beads stood for zeros and ones. The event was meant to raise awareness both of the university, the makeup brand, and women in STEM. So the organizers noted that the partnership both met the moment in pop culture and met customers where they already were. So I thought this was interesting from a compliance perspective because we tend to shy away from things that do what the advertisers call bold, relevant campaigns to build genuine connections. But pop culture can be really tricky to incorporate without kind of feeling silly or dumb or like you really just didn't hit it. Tom, is this something we should be considering, trying to do this pop culture thing, or should we just stay away from it as compliance officers?
Kristy. The
Yes.
first time I met you was at a SCCE Europe conference where you sauntered down mid-stage, turned around, and you had a wizard's hat on, and you channeled your inner Karnak the Magnificent. I can't remember what your character was named, but certainly Compliance Kristy was in the air. And you began to tell us and prognosticate for us. And you were incorporating pop culture into your presentation to lead to your overall presentation on compliance. I have seen you do that literally for the first time I met you. It doesn't surprise me this story spoke to you, as it should. But we should all be thinking about this. We should all be doing this, and that's we, the collective, you and I, are both, I think, on a continuing drive or try to get the message out that compliance has to be engaging. And it can be engaging in a wide variety of ways. I've never listened to a Taylor Swift song, but
That's
she
impossible.
may not be my...
That's impossible. You live in the world. Go ahead.
It doesn't mean that she's not relevant to our audience. Simply because it's not my cup of tea doesn't mean it's not your cup of tea. And having this, and you name the pop culture. Karen Woody and I did an entire podcast series on Succession from the compliance perspective. Why not take Succession and talk about it inside your corporation? Or my Star Trek series of trekking through compliance. It doesn't matter. If you can tie Taylor Swift into STEM to get more girls interested in STEM topics, and then you take them to a corporation and say, okay, show me your ones and zero beads. Now let's talk about how you use them. And you begin to talk to them about coding, and they begin to see how coding relates to cosmetics, how it relates to beauty, and all of those things. I think you're going to engage a completely new audience, or at least more of an existing audience. And the same is true for a compliance professional. We need to have those sorts of campaigns in compliance. And there are some companies that are great at this, particularly around Compliance Week. They'll do all sorts of different things. And having these references, I think people just love them, but it's storytelling. It's like the first time I saw you, you told us a story which led to your presentation, which led to us listening to you, because it's all engaging. And so when I saw this, I went, not surprised she picked that. But I was reminded the first time I met you at that conference where you did just this. So kudos to these companies, and kudos to any compliance, either functions or CCOs, who try to bring that sort of engagement into compliance.
I still hear about the wizard hat, believe it or not. They live streamed that, and a lot of people still remember that. Very happy I did it. Oh, let's switch gears back to Washington, D.C. Tom, what'd you pick next?
Here, I had three stories for us, but they all revolve around Russian sanctions. And two of them were about stories that started in Europe. One was around specifically Europe adding a 19th, the EU Europe, adding a 19th round of sanctions against Russia. There was a specific set of sanctions on the Nord Stream pipeline where Europe is trying to cut off income into Russia. And then the third story is about the Trump administration trying to get Lindsey Graham to water down his Russian sanction bills. And if I can stay non-political on this one, at least.
Good luck.
What I really want to try to illustrate is the dynamic world we're living in, where this is not one thing at noon and one thing at 5. This is two different things at noon and two different things at 5. How are you going to comply with both? How are you going to comply with the EU sanctions? And how are you going to comply with if the Trump administration backs off? Or what happens when the Trump administration says, oh, if you follow any sanctions on Russia, that's now illegal DEI. So sorry, there's my political. You have to be able to have the flexibility to navigate all of these if you're an export control officer or a U.S. corporation, and you're going to have to pay attention to what all of these different jurisdictions are saying, because they may be saying things that are antithetical to each other.
Yeah, this is a civics lesson. There's supposed to be 3 co-equal branches of government. The article did note that there are enough votes in Congress to override a presidential veto if it comes to it, but my money is on Mr. Graham backing down instead of taking this thing to a veto in the Senate. But when sanctions conflict, it's horrible. When I was in Europe, Middle East, and Africa trying to be the director of compliance, we had the French part of the travel agency that had sent people to Cuba for 50 years. And then all of a sudden, because they had some majority American ownership, we told them they couldn't do it. And I mean, that experience was really hard. And I think that happens to a lot of companies. So hopefully we won't get conflicting sanctions, but there's certainly conflicting viewpoints about what sanctions actually should be. So let's turn to how to say no at work, which is related to our last story about saying no at work when someone's pressuring you. This is from the Wall Street Journal, and it's a perennial problem for many people to say no, both at work and in their personal lives. So I was interested in hearing the advice from the expert who was writing this piece. So we as humans fear saying no because we think it'll damage relationships and concerned that people won't help us later if we need help. The author disagrees. She believes that saying no appropriately conveys decisiveness and being a purpose-driven individual. I like that. So when do we say no? There's a framework for that. So if the request is low cost in time or money, but is highly beneficial to others, you say yes. If it is a high cost in time or money request with minimal benefit to others, say no. That's part of it. Now, many of us are guilty of not being direct enough when we say no. Things like hedging our bets, saying we'll respond later when we know the answer is no, or ghosting are not helpful in replying. So the author is adamant that we should identify a set of principles upon which we rely in saying yes or no to requests. So her most poignant advice is to communicate in a principles way to say no directly. For instance, instead of saying, I can't take meetings after 6 p.m., say, I don't take meetings after 6 p.m. because that's family time. Don't is different than can't, because can't can be temporary or changed, and don't is a principled response. I don't know, Tom, I thought this was interesting. What do you think of this advice? Does saying no, don't, can't, are they different? Do you think it'll make a difference? What do you think of this advice?
Did you ever say no at Gibson Dunn?
Not a Gibson, God. I don't even know what would have happened, but...
There you go. Question answer.
Okay, yeah.
I never said no.
Is not the same thing as normal jobs, let's be honest.
And that's exactly the point I wanted to make. It depends on the culture. We read about these investment banks where if you leave before 11:30 p.m., you're viewed as, oh, you have capacity. And I never said no in the law firm, but that was the culture of the law firm. But the thing was, in the law firm, if I was being asked to spend a weekend, a partner was up there spending a weekend. They weren't giving it to me so they could go water skiing. So there was just a culture of hard work for the people I worked for. If your family time is important to you, make that clear. If you've been given an assignment that is of low benefit but high cost, you might actually think about, can I maybe rejigger this assignment, or can I see if there's a way to make this assignment less costly or raise the benefit it brings to either the company, myself, or my co-employees. I'm not sure how I shake out on all of this, but if family time after 6 p.m. is important, you should absolutely positively say, I don't take meetings after 6 because that's my family time.
To give Gibson Dunn credit here, we had some very observant Jews and people who were Mormon, and their boundaries were very well respected. So I will at least give them that the religious piece did, but I just don't want to, would definitely not have been okay. All right.
I hear you.
Where are we going next?
So we go over to I-4 and talk about Florida Man.
All right. I thought we were going to talk a little bit, though, before we do, about Mr. Bondi and the election in Washington, D.C. that recently happened. What happened there, Tom?
That actually lends itself to a Florida Man framework. Brad Bondi, the brother of the Attorney General, ran for president of the D.C. bar. And I think with over 40% of lawyers voting, he was trounced about 91% to 9%. And it was an absolute trouncing, and I think it's an expression of what the D.C. bar thinks of Brad and his sister, and I can't think of it happening to a better set of siblings. Karen Woody worked in and around Brad at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and apparently he was well known for his treatment of people who worked under him, and he sent out things called Brad memos, which were multi-page, single-spaced memos of his expectations, including the temperature of the hot water brought for his tea each morning. It didn't surprise me. And it's nice to see the D.C. bar stand up for itself.
I can't imagine why it went the way it did. All right, let's go over to Florida. We're going to pull over and park ourselves at the end of today's episode with another tale from the Sunshine State, where laws of logic take a permanent vacation. Florida man Barry Lee Hastings Jr. was feeling the power of his black Crown Victoria car. He liked the look so much that he went out and bought some white and amber lights that made the car look suspiciously like a cop car. And to complete the look, he added a functional siren box and a CB radio. Mr. Hastings clearly wasn't just content looking the part, he wanted to act it too. So he decided to pull over a car he thought was going too fast. But the person he pulled over wasn't having it. That pulled over person asked to see this cop's credentials. Taken aback, Mr. Hastings Jr. said he left them at the station, then asked the pulled over driver to come with him to the station so he could prove that he was a cop. Turns out the pulled over vehicle didn't need directions to the police station because the driver was an off-duty cop. Now, this is the plot. The plot is taking a U-turn. When the real deputy threatened to call for backup, our impersonator took off. And when the police chased him down, officers found the lights and sirens, but no badge, no cuffs, and definitely no authority. Mr. Hastings Jr. faced a charge of impersonating an officer. And Tom, the moral of the story here is that flashing lights and a fake badge don't give you cop-y rights, but they do give you a chance to hear your Miranda rights.
Where's the wizard hat when you need it?
I'm Kristy Grant-Hart. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm Tom Fox.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.